Hi everyone, my name is Erin Mayfield and I will be giving you my presentation on the percussionist language found in jazz dance. To start off, I want to take a moment to have you try something for me. I want to play a game with you, and it's called the noise game. It's very simple. I'm going to give you a sound, and however you are physically able to, I want you to recreate that sound, whether it's produced by your mouth, your voice, or by utilizing part of your body. For example, if I played this sound, I could mimic it by doing ding. So now it's your turn. Make this noise. Now try making this one. How about, or now for the hard part, I want you to recreate this next noise using only your body, not your mouth or your voice. Now try recreating this using only your body. Tick, tick, doom. Maybe try this one. Boom, da, ding. Finally, I want to pose a question. While playing the noise game with me, were you making music? Or when I asked you to use only your body, did it suddenly move from music to dance? Could it possibly have been both? Through this presentation, I will be seeking to answer that by stating that yes, it is both. Jazz dance uniquely allows for the noise created within the classroom by students, whether how they speak, how they move, to facilitate the learning of choreography and technical terms of jazz dance. This differs from the technical curriculum of other genres in that even though much of jazz pedagogy borrows from ballet practice, it is originally entirely separate from ballet's Western European roots. Jazz pedagogy has a rich history of West African music and was transformed through popular culture to become the genre of music and dance known modernly as jazz in all of its subgenres. Jazz is a rhythmically complex genre that derives its intensity from its traditional African roots, making the genre of dance just as complex and subdivided. And in order to achieve the sharpness and rhythm or of rhythmic accuracy demanded by this genre, the curriculum of jazz dance will employ a basis of oral skills learning in order to allow for the genre to not only become more accessible to beginner dancers and diverse groups, but to also allow for a percussive understanding of rhythm found in the choreography along with its music. The information I have gathered to come to this understanding was derived from a set of tools intended to collect diverse data. These tools included interviews with both jazz dance teachers and students, audio and video recordings of my Jazz 1 dance class, observations of my Jazz 1 dance class, all-level jazz lab, and local professional dance performances. And finally, my own auto-ethnographic observations from taking this beginner jazz class taught by Dr. Allison Duffy, with my only previous experience being that of a beginner ballet class taught in the same dance program by Professor Kyla Olson. I find authority and justification in these data gathering tools from readings of ethnographic fieldwork done by researchers Clifford Geertz, Dr. Jill Flanders Crosby, and Marina Roseman. So, to begin to understand the complexity of dance pedagogy and its motivations and intentions, we should identify and analyze the basic components that make up the typical jazz dance class, such as structure and physical spaces. When I enter the creative movement studio on a Monday or Wednesday, I come in through the female locker room. I tuck my belongings in the corner outside of a locker. And I usually come dressed for my class so I can immediately exit the locker room and make my way into the dance studio where my jazz class takes place. The jazz studio is a rectangular space with one of its long walls covered lengthwise entirely in mirrors. The wall opposite the mirror is covered in bleacher-style seating, and the door that I enter puts both the seating on my left and the mirrors on my right. The wall to this door is on the is where curtains sit tied back. And there's large speakers on both walls that are the shorter walls. There is a stereo system that controls the music the speakers on both walls produce. And all of the elements I just described surround an open floor, mirrors, seating, speakers, open floor, which is where my jazz class takes place. The structure of a typical jazz dance class takes place in an intentional order in order to prepare a dancer's body to move more than is demanded of our daily lives. Our teacher will start with a series of warm-ups, all with different purposes and all set to different music. The first warm-up, as far as I have observed, can either be a phrase of muscle group isolations or a cardio sequence. Both are intended to wake up our muscles. These warm-ups will be set to moderately upbeat music, and will usually have phrases choreographed so that the movements land on beat to require the dancer to work to keep themselves on tempo. The next section of class is conditioning. After dancer muscles are warm, a quick tempo pop song will be turned on, something that most people will recognize. and they will be led through abdominal conditioning. Abdominal conditioning is especially important in jazz because, as exemplified by the warm-up of isolations, having defined control over the different muscle groups is an important stylistic element of jazz dance. Having the strength to create sharp rhythms and evident lines in the body, lines meaning a picturesque moment of the arms and or legs extended to form different shapes, is only made possible by toned muscles and practice control. The final warm-up of the jazz classes I have observed go through stretching. This is especially important because in order to fulfill the movements that choreography demands, dancers need to be flexible. And this also eliminates the buildup of lactic acid in muscles that causes soreness and keeps the dancer from performing choreography at the level of intensity that they need to. Finally, after all of these necessary steps are taken to prepare a dancer's body, the class is led through combination work, where they will either be taught new dance choreography or asked to practice material that has already been given to them. After the rehearsal time is ended, dancers will usually come together with their teacher or for classroom reminders and a final send-off to the class for the day. In a traditional ballet setting, this could look like a thank you to musicians and to our instructor. However, in the jazz class that I am a part of, our professor Allison Duffy will circle up with us, and in unison we would do a clap slap on the ground in a simple rhythmic send-off. So now with this thorough understanding of what a beginner jazz dance class looks like at Texas Tech, both in its physical structure and class layout, it's possible to begin to understand music and its place in the context of the jazz classroom. The physical places that music occupies in my jazz class are the stereo system and its 2 speakers. These pieces of technology physically create a part of the soundscape of the classroom. The other noises that help create the aural landscape are very diverse and intentional, consisting of the voices of dancers, their movements, and the teacher and her instructions. These elements, along with the music, create the soundscape I enter every class period. Our instructor is key in making the soundscape at any given moment during class. She can quiet us to ensure that we hear and understand her directions, and she also chooses the music for every single activity that we perform. Music's role may seem obvious in its relationship to dance. It gives a dancer something to dance to. However, its purpose extends deeper than that in terms of dance pedagogy. In order to create the correct environment for learning, Dr. Duffy would intentionally choose music in order to facilitate the mood and tempo she deemed necessary for each activity. For example, in our cardio warm-up, Dr. Duffy has us move to the beat of a rock song. And then as we come to the floor for conditioning, a pop song written by an artist everyone knows would come on to create a familiar upbeat environment. After our workout, Duffy would have us lay on the floor to stretch, and slower 2000 pop jams would enter the soundscape, again moving to fit the slower tempo of the activity. The music she chose not only gave us something familiar to sing along to and made class inviting, it would bring us to a level of mood and energy flow best suited for the task at hand. So the instructor not only has complete control over the music and thus the soundscape of the classroom, but also the overall flow of activity and therefore the dancers. No matter what teacher I worked under, whether it was Dr. Duffy, Aaron Alvarado, Kyla Olson in both jazz and ballet contexts, or Chris Olson, the music choices specifically may have been different, but the intentions of creating familiar and workable soundscapes to facilitate learning and participation of dance activities was always the same. The flow of energy that chosen music directs creates the comfortable environment of our jazz class and thus facilitates a relaxed social dynamic between students of all different calibers and our instructors. Naturally, we as humans have unspoken and even subconscious decisions that we make to create suitable social environments for learning and engaging with other people. A simple example of this is the groupings of dancers in the locker room. There's an unspoken barrier of where dance majors will place their belongings versus someone like me, a music major who is just taking the dance class to explore other musical skill sets, will place my belongings. The majority of my class will place their belongings in the jazz studio, but 2 other women, Anna and Maria, who leave their backpacks in the locker room, also leave their stuff on the outside of this unspoken boundary near my own. There's no malicious intent behind these area markers, just natural social awareness. And this idea steadily bleeds into our beginner dance class, as friends will place belongings near one another and will stand next to one another during class activities. Going beyond just familiarity with friends, though, there are other psychological variables that decide where members of the class stand, specifically their authority and their confidence level. Our instructor, Dr. Duffy, will almost always place herself at the front of the group, and as she demonstrates and leads us through phrases. So as you can see here, if this is the mirror at the front of the room, the audience seating, this is Professor Duffy, the triangle. Even when she moves to the back of the group for a different perspective as a teacher, she is consciously doing so in order to create a shift in dynamic so to keep students focused and engaged. Our focus must stay with her, and so we have to consciously focus on shifting our attention to her new placement. Another level to these psychological placements that I first noticed within myself and then later in my peers is the positioning of oneself in relation to the instructor and even to the mirrors at the front of the class. I first began to think of about this idea when Duffy would ask us to change places after ending an activity, and when working specifically on actual choreography, she would ask us to switch lines. Instinctively, if I wasn't fully confident in new material that I was just taught, I would not only place myself in direct view of Dr. Duffy, so I could mimic her movements, but I would also put myself behind peers who had a better grasp on material than me. My classmate Mira also engaged in this exact thought process, so we would almost always end up dancing next to each other. Putting ourselves behind a peer who was more confident in their kinetic knowledge not only gave us another person to follow besides Dr. Duffy, and thus creating a moment of dual authority between our teacher and an experienced student, but also created a physical and psychological barrier between us and any mistakes that we would make in the mirror. When Duffy would make us switch lines, asking the people in the first row to move to the second and vice versa, it dropped this wall and would force us to not only visually engage with the movements we were creating, but also evaluate ourselves in real time. The lines of dancers that formed would slightly vary depending on the activity, such as when I put myself in the front and to the side during abdominal conditioning, so over like in this area, and back into the center and second line when we moved to the choreography. So back down here where I pointed earlier. These social and psychological placements would also vary in jazz labs on Friday because the group demographic would shift from being all level 1 students to a mix of levels 1, 2, and 3. The natural social groupings would occur, so levels 1, 2, and 3 would almost systematically place themselves in clumps together with gentle overlap. And members of my level 1 class who put themselves in certain areas of our Jazz 1 class would still find a variation of their comfortable placement in the all-level jazz lab, but with the option to now place themselves behind 2 or even 3 rows of people instead of the original 1 row. I found myself at the beginning of this semester at the far back of the jazz labs, and upon reflection, noting a lack of confidence that I had around older and more skilled dancers, as well as an unfamiliarity with the ever-rotating instructor of the week. As I became better acquainted with the upper-level teachers who would periodically lead the jazz lab, I found myself moving up in the confidence ranks, so to speak, as the labs tended to be more focused on abdominal conditioning rather than teaching dance technique. All of this psychological awareness came into focus after our midterm, which was a written exam along with a quantitative self-evaluation that we would discuss with our instructor. When I had my one-on-one discussion with Dr. Duffy about my progress in class and my performance of a phrase of choreography we learned in the first part of the semester, I was pleasantly surprised to find that she had graded me higher than I had myself. I was also surprised to see the things that she had graded me best on, my improvisational skill and my styling, were the things that I had scored myself lowest on. I attributed to this fact to the idea that I view myself personally as a perfectionist, something that I've never been able to shake since beginning music as a child. However, upon brief interviews with my classmates, I discovered that many people had done the exact same thing. Specifically, a senior theater major named Virginia, whom I look up to as a dancer. Virginia is one of 2 dancers I found myself using as my front row barrier almost every single day in class. I found with my brief interview with her, as well as other classmates, Molly, Miera, Chloe, and Maria, that all of us had, in some variation, graded ourselves more harshly than Dr. Duffy. This phenomenon intrigued me, as even though all these dancers would position themselves in different parts of the class and thus in different confidence manifestations, it didn't stop any of us from judging ourselves as if we were supposed to be perfect. We all graded our dancing to the standard of experienced dancers, even though we should have all been giving ourselves the graces of beginners. And I believe the pressure that we put on ourselves to live up to came from the fact that just like music, dance is an expressive art with a long, rich history. We weren't only grading ourselves based on technique and stylistic approach at the beginner level, we were also comparing ourselves to more experienced dancers, whether that be upper level classmates here at Tech or professionals that we had grown up watching on stage and on screen. And this was all too easy to do because we watched the movie Fosse in class, a recording of onstage compilations of choreographic highlights from Bob Fosse's career, as well as when we would watch professional dance companies such as Lubbock's Flatlands Dance Theater. We could pick out moves and stylistic techniques that we had already learned in class ourselves. And this fact just further emphasized to me the accessibility of jazz dance, that as early as day one, a dancer could start to learn these steps that professionals were doing in commercial and theatrical settings. Excuse me. As a whole, I believe that jazz dance is an accessible dance form to new students. The genre opens itself up to multiple types of learning while granting students the freedom to learn technique, style, and rhythm in a non-traditional way. Dance most obviously engages in two types of learning, kinetic and visual learning. The visual learning occurs when an instructor demonstrates moves or a dancer watches themselves in studio mirrors, with the kinetic learning happening constantly in the body. Both these learning methods perpetuate an idea that dance pedagogy relies on nonverbal teaching methods in order to communicate technique and style articulation, an idea that I entered my Jazz 1 class with at the beginning of the year. I knew verbal cues were given in the form of dance language in order to describe phrases either during or before we started dancing. Verbal descriptions of phrases using French terminology was essential to learning the basis of traditional Western dance in my Ballet 1 class with Kyla Olson. However, entering the jazz class with this knowledge, there was an assumption that these terms would be given as descriptions of choreography along with nonverbal demonstrations. This, I believed, would be the extent that verbal and thus audio learning would take place. When I posed the question of how nonverbal she believed jazz dance was, our professor, Dr. Duffy, immediately responded that she didn't think it was much at all. The stylistic elements, along with necessary verbal instruction that make up jazz dance, allows jazz to be much more verbal than other genres of dance. This is not to say that if you walk into a ballet or a contemporary dance class, the room would be silent besides the occasional remark of the teacher. However, the traditional etiquette of ballet classes that has bled over into the practices of most dance pedagogy is that dancers will not speak excessively during class. In my jazz class, verbal enthusiasm, questions, comments, and noises in general were hardly, if ever, met with a hush from our teacher, let alone affected our participation grade in class as it did for me in ballet in the previous semester. This allowance of spoken word made my class feel much more inviting, and I noticed a shift from traditional dance learning because of this lenience. In a traditional ballet class, there's a standard of terminology fluency that is required of the dancer. However, my Jazz 1 class, I perceived a word bank of rhythmic vocabulary that aided dancers in their journey to vocabulary fluency. This concept isn't unique to jazz, and I was introduced to it as an aid to learning French terms in my ballet class. Kyla Olson told us in ballet that if it was easier for us to call a battement, a high kick, that we could do so as long as we eventually could translate that to French terminology. If you don't know what a battement is, look at the resources in my student wiki, and I have linked a video. The same idea was implemented in my jazz class, but along with calling certain moves kicks or spins, onomatopoeias in context to the rhythm of the movements were used as well. For example, while running through choreography in class one day, my classmate Mira asked Dr. Duffy to review a certain move. She exclaimed that she couldn't remember the name of the move, but it sounded like tick-da-ding. Dr. Duffy immediately was able to identify that move, a kickball change. Again, if you don't know what that is, look for the linked video. In the context Mira was asking about, only because the onomatopoeias that she used matched the rhythm of the kickball change in context to the music. This phenomenon was confirmed later in the semester when learning a new phrase of choreography, and Dr. Duffy herself made a similar reference to a dance move using the onomatopoeia da-dun, da-dun. That was what Dr. Duffy called the move, and when asked by Molly what the name of the move was that she had had experience from with a different show she had done, Dr. Duffy said that was its name. As far as Duffy knew, that move that we were doing, which was known by numerous choreographers, did not have a name, and so she just called it da-dun, da-dun. This phrasing of onomatopoeia indicates with it the syncopation of the jumping crisscross step that it is. The move itself is always performed in syncopation. However, Mira's kickball change, tick-da-ding, was only relevant to that choreography. A kickball change, if following the same theory, could be notated with tick-tick-doom, tick-doom-da, or her tick-da-ding. and they all indicate through their wording a different emphasis on rhythm. This idea of employing rhythmic sounds, like the sounds someone would make if they were mimicking rhythms to communicate dance steps in context with music, is something that Dr. Duffy has been doing all semester in order to make the syncopation and complexity of rhythm found in our choreography orally accessible to the dancers while they move through new material. To show this, I will play an audio recording of Dr. Duffy teaching the Jazz 1 class new material while instead of saying dance terminology and counting out beats, she instead sings the music off words while demonstrating our movements.
You just did, and you can't forget the rest. Dun, 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 dun. So, yeah.
I have found that the technique of counting out beats and using proper terminology is employed more by advanced jazz teachers, such as Aaron Alvarado, than my Jazz 1 teacher, Dr. Duffy. Professor Alvarado, as I discovered in my jazz labs with experienced dancers, will demonstrate dance moves, but is more likely to use specific terminology and beat counts to describe a phrase of movement beforehand, and never verbally give the oral skills demonstration I saw from Dr. Duffy. Fundamentally, I don't think that Dr. Duffy does this because it's easier for her to teach material this way, but rather that it's easier for her students to learn dance terminology by associating it with rhythmic sounds. This indicates that more so in beginner jazz classes than in upper level jazz settings, a teacher will employ not only kinetic and visual learning methods, but also oral skills. Oral skills is a essential part of a musician's curriculum, but to my knowledge, it's not emphasized in the dance arts. Including this approach to learning not only breaks down syncopation and complex rhythms to a basic form before introducing them into the body, but it also makes learning choreography much more accessible to an audio learner whose predominant learning style doesn't line up with kinetic or visual. Chris Olson, an experienced dancer in many different genres, as well as a trained music educator, subbed as our professor in our jazz lab one day and led our class through a phrase of body percussion, closing the gap between oral and kinetic learning. Chris sat with us in a giant circle and started by describing and demonstrating steps as well as giving us the counts. A moment that stuck out to me is when we performed a series of thigh slaps in rhythm. We would slap our own thighs as well as the thighs of the person next to us. In the middle of this, when we were to move our hands, like we were about to land on the person next to us, but then come back to our own legs in rhythm. Chris described the step on the rhythm it was performed in context as psych out your neighbor. This percussive description of the step helped us remember the movement flawlessly in time with the music, and everyone in the circle, while being quiet and focused throughout all of the other movements, would suddenly sing along to the dance move lyrics that Chris created for us. Chris Olson, Dr. Duffy, and my classmate Mira helped me recognize the verbal language of movement in context of the jazz classroom. The percussive language used to give rhythmic context to movement made class accessible and fun, while also facilitating the learning of complex concepts and formal dance terminology. Jazz dance pedagogy, I propose, employs not only the traditional ideas presented in a formal ballet setting, but also a vernacular of rhythm well acquainted with the traditional West African roots of jazz. This language of percussion is used to employ in beginner settings more so than advanced jazz settings to ensure the musical retention of dance terminology and choreography, and helps explain the reason that so many subgenres of jazz, such as hip hop, stomp, body percussion, swing, tap, and many variations of musical theater choreography have been derived from it, all while creating the beautiful body lines that pair up with the explosive and vibrant style that is characteristic of jazz dance.